Okay, so basically I found that it's really hard to actually sit down and write everything about my world tantalar, so I'm going to be doing audio logs for it. Hopefully this will make it so that later I can go back to my audio logs, use them, and actually write this stuff. So right now I'm going to basically talk about the history of tantalar in our world. This has been going on for middle school, maybe? I don't know. It's basically, I had another world, sci-fi, basically, but I took like everything and shoved it in there. Anything I liked from other stuff, I took and shoved in this thing, and it was called POE, which is, stood for Planet Everything, which was the original world I created when I was like 5 or something. Anyway, I found that eventually got too convoluted, too messy, there's too much stuff I put into it that it really, I don't know, I abandoned it. I created Tantalar, which is a fantasy world. And the whole entire history of Tantalar is there was like this thing called the Expanse. And it was empty, except for in the middle, there was like this giant ball of energy. Eventually, it became sentient, and it actually had multiple sentiences. It started spawning multiple sentiences. And they started eating each other and reproducing, like splitting off and creating new ones, sentient energy creatures. And it created a cycle where they were eating each other, consuming each other, and then splitting off, and eating each other, splitting off over and over again. And it's happened for a long time. What happened though was one of those energy beings got tired of that constant stuff and separated itself from one of these energy entities, as I'm going to be using that term more often, split off and got bored with it. And he ended up using his power. It used his power to create a world. And that's where Tantalar came from. And he created the world, and he created trees, and he created a kind of spirit for the world. Trees, water, earth. He created the landscape and everything. And then he created two gods, one of light and one of darkness. And he let them create the stuff to live on there, the creatures to live on there. And he wanted to have them make us stuff for him to entertain himself, because he was bored with the constant stuff that was going on in the Expanse, which was just very eat and split. He was tired of that. So, God of Light, this era, the first era was called the Era of Birth. And then the second, when he stopped creating, he created those two gods, and he let them go, and it became the Age of Building. And the Light Goddess, she made the humans, the dwarves, the gnomes, halflings, all the races that wanted to create and build order and everything. She was responsible for, and she did that. And the Dark God, he created all the. He was jealous, and he wasn't like. He didn't create to create. He created to kind of mimic and tear down. He created the orcs, the goblins, the trolls, monstrous creatures that were just meant to tear down all the evil creatures that were made to just kind of mimic and tear down what the light god made, what the goddess made. And eventually they started fighting among each other, and they both created their own set of dragons. Ended up during that time that one person, Ultimar, he was this great artificer. He created great artifacts, best known for the Ultimar sword. And he took 6 apprentices with him, and he taught them how to create artifacts like he could. but one of them was greedy about it, and he created this artifact called the Dragon Soul. And it was this orb that could control all the dragons, and he used it to try and control the world. Well, all the other apprentices, Ultimar's apprentices, tried to defend the world against this guy, and they all died. And Ultimar had to intervene himself, and he ended up stopping the Wayward apprentice, but he ended up was mortally wounded by it. Before he died, though, like it wasn't like he knew he was gonna die, but it wasn't a right away thing. He sealed away his sword because he felt it was too powerful, and made the key be all the artifacts of his apprentices, so that only when someone had gathered all the artifacts could someone unlock the sword. And he split them. He scattered them all across the world by giving them to people who he trusted to do that. The Dragon Soul itself was imprisoned in this fortress that these people who chose not to do anything. And for that, they were cursed with the whole entire. They chose not to intervene with the Dragon War, with much everyone else that intervened on, even the light and the good gods and creatures. They all intervened to try and stop the dragons. But this guy chose not to do anything, and the light goddess cursed him with living forever to guard the Dragon Soul as his punishment. And they put all the dragons asleep underneath his castle. Also, during that time, other entities came to be. They came to notice what the first entity, which became known as Master, had created, and they did not seek. A lot of them sought to emulate it and create their own worlds, but they didn't really create it for the same purpose that Master did, and really failed to achieve what Master did. But other ones didn't seek to create their own worlds. Instead, they asked Master if they could take place in the world. Most noticeably, Cleton, the god of death. He proposed this whole entire cycle of life and death to Master. Master liked it, liked the idea of what Cleton pitched. I'll go more into that later. Also, Iskra, the god of chance, an entity who reveled in the ways of chance and randomness, also asked Master if he could be part of Tantalar, and Master, of course, liked that. The randomness. He liked adventures. He liked interesting things going on in his world. So of course he let Iskra in. Anyway, after all the dragons went away, the dark god, created giants. And these are not like the giants you think from D&D, where they're just kind of like not that dangerous, not that life threat. No, these giants were like, how I purpose them is that they're like these huge things, like 30, 40 feet tall. Like they tower over everything, and it takes hundreds of men, thousands of men to kill one of them. He didn't create that many of them, and he created this one called Titan, and it was bigger than all of them. It was huge. It was, no one could stop it. And Light Goddess, she reacted by giving weapons, magically enchanted weapons, to her people. Not a lot of them, but whenever someone used them, they give it magical, like super powers, super speed, super resilience, super strength to combat the giants. And they did. They killed a lot of them, and except for Titan, which was He was too powerful. Many of her champions died fighting Titan, and honestly, the world was getting torn apart by this. So there was a sorcerer who appeared before both the gods and promised to get rid of the other gods, get rid of the giants to the light goddess, and promised to get rid of the weapons for the dark god. And he said he would do it if they would grant him one wish, which he said he would wish for once he did what he said to do. And they both agreed. So there was this final conflict that was going to happen that was going to basically break the world in two. And the sorcerer showed up. And he waved his hand and cast his giant spell. And all the giants fell asleep. And the world swallowed them up. Like they all started falling asleep. And when they fell asleep, the world swallowed them up. The Titan started disappearing, and he phased out of the world. And as he was doing this, all the weapons started doing the same. They started disappearing too. And they were both gone. And both the god and the goddess showed up, and they demanded the sorcerer what was the thing. And he said, I did what you did. I said I did, and my wish. And he suddenly changed into Master. And Master was like, yeah, this is not what I wanted. I didn't want my world destroyed. If the world's destroyed, my story ends. And I want the story to keep on going. So I wish for both of you to shatter into more gods, weaker gods, that can't do stuff like this. So, light goddess shattered, and she became Novish, the god of noble rule, good rule, kings who rule with their people in mind. Wilton, the god of wisdom, Guardia, the goddess of protection, Helia, the goddess of charity and healing, and the goddess, I think it was, I got this book that I wrote some of my stuff in, but I never got around to writing all of it. Let's see, is this grad, Lord Chance, song, shadow. Falar. I guess that's what her name was, Falar. She was the goddess of trade, bringer of fair winds, and she was the good goddess of the ocean. And the dark god, he separated, and he became Shadow, the god of deception, shadows, darkness, Radiotheria, the god of betrayal, treachery. Basically, also kind of like the opposite of Novish, where he was kings who kind of deceived their people, and so the kingdom rulers who were not good. Leos, the god of suffering, pestilence. He was also the first god of the sun. He suffering, torture, disease. Kragar, the god of war, blood, slaughter, murder. Gesia, the goddess of greed, beauty. I mean, this is like the bad kind of beauty. The other kind of opposite end, the good goddess, was Helia. She's the good goddess of beauty. I mean, that's more of a natural, pure beauty. While Gesia is kind of the fake beauty for the whole entire exploitation of people. So that's what kind of Gesia is. What else? Pages. There's also Guardia, Wilton, Media. Media is the goddess of healing, excuse me. Rubbish. Also, the good gods did separate into actually changed his name. Right now, it's in this book it was Talator, but it changed to Silvara. And that was the god of solitude, lord of elves, and the god of the good forest. Rhaegor, Gesia, Radiotheria. This one is Radiotheria. Leos, that haven't changed. Okay, So that was pretty much. Where is the bad guy? Tisha. What was the bad guy? Oh, it was a Tixar. Tixar? Xanu. I called him Xanu. Tixar or Xanu? I haven't actually worked on him too much, in all honesty. But he was the bad god. He's the god of storms, god of the Naga, god of hail, bad weather kind of thing. That's what Tixar Xanu was. Anyway, they split up, and they didn't have these gods. They didn't have the power to create their own creatures from scratch, like the first two gods could. They were able to take the souls of people, which was it's kind of, I'm going to explain a little more when I go into that in its own session about the whole entire systems of Tantalar. But they would take the souls of people who followed them, like champions of them, and they can convert them into what I call ascendants. And it would convert their soul into this energy, God energy, and it would basically be what angels and demons or outsiders were. They each had their own realm where their outsiders lived, and sometimes their outsiders would go into the material world and further the cause of their god. But generally, it was not. It was a kind of a chess game. So if you get too involved, your people get too involved, another god will act and send their ascendants. And no one wanted to. It was kind of a stress thing, and they had to be very careful about it because they didn't want it, if it got too bad, Master would get involved, and then the gods would they were all afraid of what Master would do to them because he broke two really powerful gods in half, into parts, shards, and they didn't want that to happen to them, so they never really did much. They had their own. He gave them their own plane to fight on, the ascended plane, which all their realms met on, and they would fight. And the Great Ascended War happened, and continues to happen all throughout history. And on that plane, they would fight among each other. And during the next age, because when that happened, the age of building ended, and the age of exploration happened, and these great empires started forming, and they started spreading out, settling new land, and they spread across the world, from settling in the Great Sea to the west. To the west there was the Great Sea, and there was islands on there. They would settle many of the islands over there, and explored far out there. Many different people and kingdoms follow that, and they expanded up onto the ridges of the spine of the world, which they didn't really cross paths because there was nothing really beyond it. On the other side of the spine of the world was this desert called the Burning Sands, and it's because the sands, the grains of sand would burn into your skin, so no one had ever really crossed that. And they started, there was a lot of separate kingdoms started forming, and one really big one, the High Elves, formed the Empire Tantalar, and they absorbed a lot of kingdoms into them, and the Empire Tantalar got pretty big. And this is when the Empire Tantalar kind of stopped. Like, there was a war that eventually happened because people were afraid of them, and they all allied kind of against it. And the Empire Tantalar was like, okay, we'll stop. Just stop attacking us. I guess we bit off a little more than we chewed. So they stopped expanding, and the other kingdoms grow out. And that's when the Age of Creation started. One big organization in one kingdom actually took over, called the Academy of Arcane Studies, and they created this arcane kingdom. And it was one of the biggest kings, hard worker, one of the more powerful ones, because it was such most mages hanged out there and they had a lot of power. So a lot of people were afraid to offend them. Well, not offend them, but get on the bad side because, yeah, mages, lots of them, dangerous. So even the Empire Tantalar was afraid of them, and they were huge, most powerful military force. But I mean, a bunch of mages. So anyway, during the Age of Creation, the Arcane Kingdom actually wasn't that. Was more of a collaborator. They didn't actually. A lot of people were afraid of them, but they were like the collaborators. Like, well, they were like they didn't work against people. They actually helped other kingdoms, less fortunate kingdoms. They tried to actually improve the quality. They did improve the quality of the world a lot and helped with exploration a lot. And they were a lot into just improving the quality of the world, which they did. And but their power also settled many disputes. Their involvement would generally cause all the kingdoms to be like, okay, we don't want the mages to get involved because they'll wreck our shit. So let's stop and make compromises. Yeah, that was pretty good. And this was going well with all the kingdoms pretty much living a peaceful life. With this kind of gentle giant that lived among them, which was the Arcane Kingdom and the Empire Tantalar, respectively. They both were much more helpful because the Empire Tantalar learned from the Arcane Kingdom's example that how to be more powerful is to get on everyone's good side, and they will be more willing to deal with your bullshit. So anyway, so that's was the Age of Creation, and that ended when one of the leaders, one of the most powerful leaders ever, just disappeared. There was a scuffle, supposedly, on in his courtyard, where he was having his anniversary dinner with his wife, and his wife was found dead, and he was found gone. No one knew what exactly happened, but he was gone. And the way that the next leader is chosen in the Arcane Kingdom is that you have to either be chosen by the king or beat the king in an arcane duel. And neither of those could happen. He just disappeared. So all the mages started bickering among themselves. And one researcher offered one of the higher mages in the council, he offered him an idea. He said, I've been designing this thing that could turn someone into a god. You give me the funding I need to make this item, this thing to create a god, and I'll turn you into a god, and you could rule the kingdom with that power. And the guy said, I'll do it. But he didn't know this guy was actually conspiring to use it for himself. So when he finished making the item, he made himself a god. And then he used it on himself. And the process, though, made him go insane, creating the god insanity. He doesn't actually have an official name because it constantly changing since he's insane. But when he was born, his birth cry covered 100 miles from where he created it, which was he didn't create it in the Arcane Kingdom, he created it in the Empire Tantalar because of the fighting in the Arcane Kingdom. And it was devastating to the Empire Tantalar. And the Empire Tantalar moved in and took over the Arcane Kingdom and they didn't really fight back because of all the civil war, because of the bickering over who would be king. So it was easy for them to take it over. This started the Age of Decay, where the Empire Tantalar took over, and there was this distrust between all the kingdoms now started forming because they were afraid of the military control of the Empire Tantalar would now take over them. And for some, it did. It happened. It was a slow process, but kingdoms started that depended on the Arcane Kingdom started falling into disarray too, with it gone. And also, one of the greater sorcerers, Novan, when the god of insanity was born, he went insane too from the birth, and he, in his insanity, he created a perpetual winter that covered the northern part of the world and locked it in an eternal winter, and glaciers started forming. This giant wall of ice appeared in the north, blocking off all access farther north. And the people started gathering and created these great cities on top of the hills and the mountains up there. And this formed the northern cities, what became known as the northern cities, these giant, huge cities up there. And the Empire Tantalar had to deal with all that too, and they were stretched really hard with the falling apart of the Arcane Kingdom, which led to further collapse of other kingdoms, the northern cities, which needed a lot of help supporting themselves with no food, with all their food gone and stuff like that. And it just, everything started declining. And eventually, with the disbalance of power, the dark side actually started growing. And Cleton, who's the god of death, but he's also the god of balance, and he's the god of balance, where death is usually seen as a bad thing in most worlds, but in this world, death is a natural thing. It happens. It doesn't care if you're good or bad. You're gonna die, and that's it. And he honestly he had his own set of assassins that were supposed to eliminate things that would make one side grow more powerful than the other. But he didn't account for this increase of just darkness that was growing, and goblins started taking over, coming down out of the spine. Orcs, goblins, and stuff like that started coming out and pillaging all the lands that used to be well protected, but not anymore, because the kingdoms were falling apart, and the Empire Tantalar was stretched too thin to protect everyone, and just general state of everything was in decline. And the force of darkness and the power of darkness was growing stronger. And Rayotheria got a betrayal, treachery. He conspired with his brothers, his dark god and goddesses, and to gather all the power together. And then they used that to dispose of Master. And Master flew down from the heavens out of the comet and scorched through the middle of the major Tantalar region, destroying which was where the Empire Tantalar was situated. It destroyed the Empire Tantalar, and the Dark Gods took power, took over all their churches, their followers, the Dark God creators, all took over. And this was the Age of Darkness, and this lasted for a long time, with the general state of everything even worse in the Age of Decay, where people would be used as life sacrifices, given over to orcs, goblins to do whatever they want. The population declined roughly 75% over the time, but a lot of people still clung on to hope, and they conspired to work together. Even when Rayotheria had imprisoned their gods, Cleton was the only one who really escaped it. But even him, he was neutral. He wasn't trying to get involved, although he did try to take a step against them because darkness was too powerful, and he had to try to even it out. So he sided with the good gods, but the good gods all got pretty much imprisoned by Rhea Theory since he was in power now, not Master anymore, and Master just disappeared. After he was cast out, he never reappeared in the God realm, and Cleton fled to his city. I think it was called Varan. Let me see. Yeah. Vergan? It's called Vergan. This giant city that was to the south. These mountain ranges were to the south of the major Tantalar area. And his followers had made a giant city there, and that's where most of the good followers kind of hid for the most part during this whole entire time. And the Dark Gods did try to attack it, but where it's positioned makes it really hard, along with that since Cleton survived death, he also controls a lot. His followers control the dead, pretty much. And as one of the major things is a lot of people are buried outside Vergram. Thousands, millions of people had been buried outside there. That's kind of a way to ensure their passage safely to the realm of the dead was to go to Vergram, be buried there. So their bodies would be used in Vergram's service. They didn't want to deal with that, especially with how dangerous the trip was to even get to Vergram. So the Dark Gods kind of left it like that while taking all the rest of Tantalar. Anyway, eventually, the people who wanted to overthrow the good gods came up with something, led by a giant of a man named San. He came up with a plan that he and a bunch of his most trusted people would infiltrate this tower up in the north that had a portal to the god realm, which many of the sacrifices were sent through to Rhea and Leos and all the other dark gods. So the dark gods could just play around with them and torture them as they wanted in the god realm. That he would go and sneak in there and fight Rhea and try and defeat the gods. And while he did that, the rest of the good followers would create a diversionary force. They would gather up and hold the rest of the Dark Gods' forces' attention on them, so they wouldn't notice when Sand snuck up on them. So this happened, and a general known as K. Thorn showed up to attack the diversionary force, while Sand snuck up into the tower and attacked Rhea. And the diversionary force got ripped apart. A lot of them died doing this. But when Sand managed to get up there, he seized the portal and jumped through. Leos was right there, and he pushed Leos out of the portal. And he fought on Rhea one-on-one, and he managed to skewer Rhea through. Because he wielded two-handed swords with one hand. He was just this giant man who was just a pinnacle of humanity, like a Captain America, pretty much. And he defeated Rhea with this conviction. Rhea was just surprised. He never expected anyone to do something like that. So he couldn't handle it. He couldn't stop him. And so San skewered Rheotheria through and threw him to the world. But Rheotheria landed in the ocean, so it didn't cause any problems. But his blood leaked onto this island and corrupted it, and it became known as the Darklands. And when he fell, the tower broke apart. But San took over the position of becoming a god. He became the god of good fighters, fighting right with might. He also became the god of harvest. He also became the new god of the sun, since Leosk was thrown out of the god realm. Even though Leosk was still kind of a god, he still is a god. He didn't really return to the god realm after getting kicked out by San, but he could do it. Like Master and Rheotheria were damaged, and that's why they couldn't return to the god realm. But Leosk was at full power and still is at full power, so he never left it. Anyway, he resurrected all of his people who were there in the tower, because the tower collapsed when Rheotheria fell and Leosk came out. And he resurrected as his first ascendants, the Eternals, which are these flaming, like armor. Like his armor encompasses flames. And those were his first ascendants. And also, when Nobis returned, there was 3 princes who descended from kings before the Age of Decay and everything, and they had sacrificed themselves for the. They had all been mortally wounded, but they said at least that we died trying to instill order again. And Nobis was touched by them, resurrected them as the 3 angel princes. K-Thorm disappeared, and all the forces of evil scattered when Rheotheria fell. They all knew what happened, even though they never saw it. They just could feel the absence of his presence. And they scattered, and many of Rheotheria's forces, followers, made the trip out to the Darklands, thinking that the god's blood would protect them, and in fact it did not. When they went out there, they took all the money, gold, jewels, books, lots of precious stuff with them. And when they went out there and they set up their places, started realizing the god's blood was corrupting them, mutating them into monsters. They became living personas of their evil side, and became mindless monsters. There was one section of the Darklands that was still pure. It was a holy site where a man of Wilton had died. His influence, even in death, purified the land, so never the city called Trisword Point wasn't corrupted by blood. And from there, many times there has been people who have journeyed out into the Darklands to try to get the stuff that the priests had brought with them. And many times, very few had ever returned. Many of them had been corrupted or killed by the monsters that lived out there. And many times the monsters tried to sneak in onto Trisword Point. It is a constant struggle. But it's like a very lucrative business. And you could get really rich with what you can find out there, but you have to risk death, starvation. There was nothing, like if you run out of food, there's no food out there. Or worse, becoming very monsters you had to fight. So Darklands was a very horrible place. Anyway, back to the main part, Tantalar. At that point, the first age started. This is it was a very uneven time too, like very, there's a lot of chaos during that time, because a lot of people had been a few hundred years, with the Age of Darkness, and many people didn't remember what land they owned, and many people made false claims of what they owned, how much the land was. There was a lot of fighting over the land, and many people who had been allies in the fight against evil, the age of darkness, turned against each other to try over disputes over what land was theirs, and many of the good gods couldn't help with that. They tried to instill their order. The churches tried to make it as try to instill some sort of peace and order going on, but it never lasted with the constant fighting. And, in the south, the northern cities, it was much easier. They knew where they were, and the kings had already been installed, and they knew about it. So northern cities didn't have this issue. In the middle section, it became a giant barren plain kind of thing, known as the barrens. Well, call me for ripping off World of Warcraft, but that was basically what it was. It was a barren grassland that no one really lived in except these nomads called the Sun People and their cattle, which was actually one of the best sources of leather. Best quality leather came from these sun cattle, and which the Sun People took care of, and they would trade with the North and ship it down to the South. And they, like, honest, I'm gonna load up a map at one point. I just have to get into such a condition that it would scan well, and I have to find a scanner and everything, so it's big work. I have the map. The map right now is just of the Second Age, what the Second Age looks like. And how it got to the Second Age was the Southern Pact. The Southern area, they formed this thing called the Southern Pact, which was pretty much a ceasefire agreement among all the kingdoms that had formed at that point. And they all formed this thing, the Council, the Southern Council of the Southern Pact. And this was supposedly was supposed to help with settling all disputes, and it did settle a lot of land disputes for the most part. I mean, it was a slow process. It's kind of like the UN is, that they try to step in and do stuff, but sometimes it's too slow, and people take things into their own hands. And of course, other people shame them, but it's like you can't really do much about it. And I'm going to probably end that as my first part of the history of Tantalar. I mean, this is 43 minutes video about all this stuff. So, when I do this next part, it's going to be going from explain more about the Second Age, because there's some important things that happen there in the Second Age, and moving on to, I don't know if I'm going to go all the way to 10th Age, which was the final age of the world of Tantalar, or I'll stop probably maybe around the 7th Age and start up again after that. I have to have a lot of things I know about those ages, like the general premises, but fleshing it out more. I don't know. People are probably might be like 43-minute video. What? Listen to me and they're like, Anyway, that's all for now about the history of Tantalar.